Hey, shalom everyone, this is Kris Shoemaker, also known as Yehudah ben Shomeyr, and welcome to the 613 Commandments Exposition, where we take the 613 Commandments and learn how to apply them to our daily lives. So basically, we're taking the commandments, the 613 Commandments of Torah, and putting them in a 21st century context so we know how to fulfill them in our day and age, if at all, because there's some instances, as I brought out in earlier sessions of this series, that there's some commandments that only apply to certain individuals, such as men, women, kings of Israel, agricultural farmers of Israel, Levitical priests, sons of Aaron, things of this nature. So we're just going to deal with these commandments and how to apply them to our life. So today we're going to be dealing with 13 commandments in regards to the poor and unfortunate. So we're going to learn through the Torah what our role is as individuals on how to look after and take care of the poor and unfortunate. Now, the very first one that we're going to come across is coming from Exodus chapter 22, verse 21, and it says, "You must not exploit a resident alien." Now, what is a resident alien? I am a citizen of the United States of America, but I am a permanent resident of Canada. I married a Canadian, and I haven't gone for my citizenship yet. So because we're married, I applied for a permanent resident status. So I am a resident alien of Canada. I'm from the United States, but I live in Canada now. So it says, you must not exploit a resident alien or oppress him. So a resident alien is somebody that is not your ethnicity, that is not your nationality, that is an immigrant from another country, somebody who wasn't born here. So that's what a resident alien is. It's basically a permanent resident. It's a foreigner living in a certain country. So it says you must not exploit. Now this word exploit means to take advantage of, to cheat, just to be dirty and underhanded. Now there's a lot of immigrant workers from Mexico, South America, Africa perhaps, or the Caribbean islands, and they come over here to do seasonal work in potato fields, blueberry patches. They do farming, they do agriculture, but because some of them might be illegal immigrants or illegal residents, and some of them are permanent residents or resident aliens. But just because they're of a different ethnicity, a different nationality, just because they weren't born here in the United States, a lot of farmers think, hey man, cheap labor. They'll work for peanuts. So, I'm going to hire them and I'm going to, give them way below what even minimum wage is. And so they get cheap labor. So that is one definition of exploiting a resident alien. Sometimes you have, like for instance, when I went over to England, and I was there on a mission trip, I tell you, the money was different. The quids and the different coins, and I didn't know what the equivalent was, in Canadian funds or in American funds. I was at the mercy of the merchant. I was at the mercy of the guy that was running the restaurant. I was at mercy at the guy running the tourist shop. Whenever I wanted something to eat, whenever I wanted to give something, and they told me how much it cost, I was like, and I laid the money out on the table. I'm like, what's what? And they would take what is theirs. Well, they could have cheated me. Maybe I did get cheated because I was a stranger. They exploited me and took the advantage of my ignorance regarding the economics in England, and they could have ripped me off. And this is what it's talking about. This is a negative commandment of thou shalt not. You must not exploit a resident alien or oppress him. You're not to oppress him in any way just because he was not born in this country. And the Torah gives a reason not to do this. The reason you're not to oppress or exploit a resident alien is because you were resident aliens in the land of Egypt. What was the whole purpose of the children of Israel going down to Egypt? It was to save their lives and to spare their lives from the great famine that fell upon the land. Because Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, one of the sons of Israel, went ahead of his brothers by, shady means, because his brothers sold him into slavery. He went from slave to viceroy of Egypt, second in command of Egypt. And he basically had a plan to see Egypt through a 7-year famine that was prophesied to come upon all the land. And they had plenty of food to spare, so people from other countries came to Egypt during the famine to buy food. And this is exactly what the sons of Israel did. So eventually, long story short, Joseph's brothers, his 11 brothers, moved down there with their father Jacob to wait out the famine, and they became permanent residents, resident aliens in the land of Egypt. And then, so many years went by, so many pharaohs went by, and the resident alien, which were the Israelites, were seen as a nuisance and as a possible threat, because the Egyptian says, well, they're living on the border of Egypt and Goshen. They could easily side with an invading army or an invading enemy if they wanted to take us over. So they looked at them as a threat. They also looked at them as cheap labor, free labor, because they ended up enslaving them, and they had to build cities for the Pharaoh. So they were slaves. So they were resident aliens in the land of Egypt and were taken advantage of and exploited. And because our ancestors knew what it was like to be a resident alien and to be oppressed by slavery and to be exploited by being treated unfairly just because you're a foreigner, God says, don't do this to other foreigners that are living among you. They're living among you because they want a better life. They're living among you because they want safety and security that they don't have in their own country. So don't exploit or oppress a resident alien, a foreigner, a permanent resident. Okay, enough said about that. I'll get off that horse. We'll move on. Now, in Leviticus 19:9 and Leviticus 23:22, this is a commandment. It's kind of a double commandment, like it's a thou shalt not and a thou shalt. Where it is a thou shalt not is thou shalt not reap your entire field. And there's a positive aspect of not reaping your field, a reason for not reaping your field, which becomes a positive commandment. And the reason being is so that poor people, misfortunate people, even resident aliens among you, foreigners, could be able to have food. Okay, so basically, let's set up this picture here. Back in the day, you had the Israelites who were agricultural farmers. They planted wheat, they planted barley, they planted all sorts of produce, right? And when harvest time came, they didn't have combines and machines that harvested. People had to be hired on as workers and harvest the fields. And they would collect, let's say it's wheat, and they'd collect the wheat and they would wrap it up into bundles and stand it up in the middle of the field. And then they would be taken and harvest later. So it would be kind of like, you've seen those police lines where they're looking for clues in an open field. And they would get in this long line and they would just walk and they would just look for something. That's the way they reaped the fields. So when you're reaping a field, and you're taking the wheat, some heads of wheat or grains of wheat might slip through the fingers or fall or be left behind, and the poor and unfortunate were able to go behind the harvesters and glean what was dropped, because it was against the Torah, against God's law, to pick up what you've dropped or to go back and get what you forgot and left behind. And so not only that, but God says, don't reap the corners of your field. Leave the edges of your field, the very edges. Why? So that poor people and unfortunate people who are down on their luck, who don't have jobs, who don't have a lot of food, can have pride and dignity and work for their food so they can harvest something for themselves so that they and their family could stay alive and remain alive. The book of Ruth is all about this. If you read the book of Ruth, Ruth was a Moabitess. She married into an Israelite family in Moab. Well, there was, Ruth's Israelite husband died, so her and her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi, went back to Israel. because, they couldn't make a living as widows on their own because their husbands have died. So they went back, and they were poor, they were widows, they were trying to get by, and it was harvest time. And so Ruth felt a responsibility to take care of her mother-in-law, so she went out looking for fields to glean in, and she happened upon the field of Boaz, which she thought it was by chance, but it was really by divine providence. It was by God's will that she started gleaning behind the harvesters in the field of Boaz, which was a relative of Naomi. And so, Boaz saw Naomi and said, wow, she's a Moabitess and she's working hard. He gets the backstory and who she is. And he thinks it's a very noble thing for this Moabitess, this foreigner, to stick with her mother-in-law even after her Israelite husband passed away, and to work hard and provide for her mother-in-law. So he told her, he says, stay in my fields, don't glean anywhere else. I told my workers not to harass you. You can even be so bold as to harvest some stuff for yourself. You don't have to just take the gleanings. And he treated her very favorably. So this was basically one of God's ways of instituting a welfare system. It was a welfare system, but the people on welfare still had to work. They still had to glean. They couldn't it wasn't a government official that went out and said, oh, I'll glean for you and bring this food back for you for free. No, the poor people had to go out and work for their food. And, because they couldn't get hired, or because maybe they had a disability, or because they were poor or foreigners, they were able to glean behind the harvesters and take what was left over. And there's even a commandment saying that if you left a sheaf in the field after harvest and you're like, oh crap, I forgot about that, you're not to go back and get it. You're to leave it for the foreigner. There's other commandments that were they're commandments regarding gleaning. So you remember when on the Sabbath, and it says that Jesus and his disciples were going through a grain field. And as they were walking along, they would just pluck heads of grain and rub them in their hands to get the husks off and immediately eat them. Well, according to the Torah, the 613 commandments, this was perfectly submissible. You were allowed to grab anything in anybody's field, vineyard, or tree, just enough to eat. You weren't allowed to collect. You weren't allowed to gather it in your coat or gather it in a bucket, but you could just take whatever you could eat in your hand. And you were nourishing yourself. You weren't considered working by just grabbing something to eat. But yet the Pharisee says, oh, you're breaking the law. You're working on the Sabbath. And it's like, Jesus is like, no. No, we're gleaning. We're just getting something to eat. It's not like we're working to harvest and we're going to process this grain later. We're immediately eating it. We're just satisfying our hunger. There's nothing wrong with that. Your customs and traditions have made that wrong. So that's kind of another example. And we'll probably get to some of those when we go over the other commandments. So it's a commandment not to reap the entire edges of the field so that you could leave some stuff behind for poor people to glean and to harvest. And that was, like I said, that was Israel's welfare system. That was God's welfare system for the nation of Israel. And it served several purposes. It allowed the poor person to work and to maintain their pride and dignity, not having to beg, but they were able to work for their food and to provide for their family by the sweat of their brow, which was God's design and God's intention. And they didn't get any handouts and they didn't get anything for free. So this was also waste not, want not. If you gleaned through or you harvested a field, there's a lot of stuff left behind. Well, the rats and animals are going to get it. And instead of having it just go into waste, why not bring people in to gather what they can? Now I live in Canada, and we have in the fall potato harvest. And used to, before the machines came out, the schools would have what was called potato break. And the young people would be able to get hired in the fields and earn money for school clothes and what have you, extra spending money. Well, they don't do that so much anymore, but still there are some fields and some people that hires harvesters. But even after the end of the harvest, my father-in-law would say, well, I'm going to go see the Dutchman and I'm going to get some potatoes. So it was after the harvest, the potato harvest, and my father-in-law was able to get one of those big wooden barrels and go out into the field and pick what was ever left over. And he would usually get a barrel full. That is a perfect modern day example of the Torah law of gleaning. And so, that's what happened. All right, so let's move on to the next commandment in this line of 13. Leviticus 19:9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Verse 10, do not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and resident alien. I am the Lord your God. So this is a thou shalt not, but also kind of a positive commandment. The negative is you are not to gather in gleanings, that which has fallen on the ground. So the positive aspect of not doing that is that you will be able to provide food and income for the poor and resident alien. So that's the positive part of this negative commandment. So I'm not going to dig into that or get really deep into that. So it's presented in the negative. And as I said, the flip side is the positive, which is you are to leave gleanings for the poor. You're not to gather the gleanings. Why? Because you're to leave them for the poor. That's a thou shalt. So that's a positive commandment. All right, so we're going to move on. I already read verse 10, and from verse 10, it says, do not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. You know, when you're gathering grapes or gathering olives or picking figs or picking apples, you just don't clean the tree. You pick the very best produce from whatever it is, grapes, apples, whatever, right? So there's a lot left on the tree. And this is what verse 10 is saying of Leviticus 19. Leave what's maybe not the best, maybe not the perfect, or maybe not be the top pick. Leave them for the poor. So in the Hebrew, it's oloth, meaning imperfect clusters. Do not gather the oloth, the imperfect clusters of your vineyard. So just don't gather all the grapes and be greedy. Whatever is not the best grapes, don't use. Leave them on the vine so that poor people can come along and get whatever they want or need. All right, so that's another provision. And so just as Leviticus 19:10 is thou shalt not gather the imperfect clusters, it goes on to imply leave the imperfect clusters for the poor. And this is also backed up in Deuteronomy 24:21. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, do not glean what is left. What remains will be for the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow. So it's a positive commandment. Purposely leave them behind. And in the book of Ruth, Boaz actually instructed his harvesters, go ahead and drop a few stalks so that Ruth could pick them up. Try not to be obvious about it, but purposely drop them. So these were the commandments dealing with imperfect clusters, but Leviticus 19:10 also is a negative and positive commandment to not gather in the peret, according to the Hebrew, which means just grapes. In other words, don't gather grapes that have fallen on the ground. Not imperfect grapes, but maybe it's a really good grape and it just slipped out of your hand or fell out of your basket. Don't pick it up. Leave it for the poor. So that's the negative and positive. Don't gather what's fallen on the ground for the positive reason that the poor could pick it up, right? And I mentioned this one before, and this comes from Deuteronomy 24:19 and 24:20, which talks about sheaves, and it implies fruit trees. So let's go ahead and read that. When you reap the harvest of your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, do not go back again to get it. It will be left for the resident alien, fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So if you give into this divine, godly Israeli welfare system by leaving your grain, the gleanings in your field, and leaving things in your field for the poor people to gather and to harvest behind what you've already harvested, that God will bless you for that. God will bless you for that. He says he will bless the work of your hands. All right, verse 20, when you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, do not go over the branches again. So, here it's apple country in this part of Canada. And it's potato and apple country. And it's interesting, in French, you have pomme, which is apple in French. You have pomme de terre, which means apple of the earth. And that is the French word for potato. So it's basically if you have a vineyard or an orchard, and sometimes instead of picking, sometimes people will shake the trees or knock the trees to get what's really ripe to fall, and then you pick that up and you harvest that. Instead, if you do that, don't don't shake or beat the tree twice. Leave enough on there so that if a poor person wants to shake the branches or knock the tree, some will fall off for him too. All right? So that is the commandment regarding not returning to get a forgotten sheaf, and also not to go over a tree, whether it's whatever fruit is on the tree. Don't go over it twice. The affirmative commandment also that comes from Deuteronomy 24:19-20 is to leave the forgotten sheaves for the poor. So we've kind of already gone through that, so I'm not going to delve into that any further. Moving on, it's in Deuteronomy 15:7. Let's turn there really quick to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 7, and it says, "If there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers, within any of your city gates in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother." Okay, so we've moved on from the foreigner, the permanent resident, the resident alien, the immigrant, the refugee, whatever. We've moved on from them. Now we're talking about your own. Somebody that is a native-born national resident, somebody that's part of your same faith, ethnicity. You know, they're just poor. They're just on the lower socioeconomic rung of the ladder than you are. So this is a verse dealing with them. So basically, this commandment is you are not to refrain from maintaining a poor man and giving him what he needs. So this is a law regarding charity. We're not to depend on the welfare system of the United States or the government of Canada to help the poor. If we live in a neighborhood or live in a community and we know of a poor person and know of a poor family, it's not up to the government to take care of them. It is our responsibility as followers of God, obeyers of His commandment, and followers of Messiah Yeshua, Jesus Christ, to meet that poor person's need. And to do it in such a way that helps that person maintain dignity. Don't show up blowing trumpets and a big fanfare with a bunch of groceries and say, hey, I know you guys are down on your luck. I thought you guys could use these. You do it incognito. Do it with nobody knowing or watching. Don't let them even know where it comes from. I remember one time, my father was going through a really hard time at work. He owned a service station, and man, we were on the verge of bankruptcy. We were having, my dad had a massive coin collection. He had to sell that in order for us to get by. And I remember one day my parents were just wringing their hands and all worried. We literally didn't know where our next meal was coming from, and we left to go somewhere, and we come back, there was a bag of groceries sitting on our doorstep. Have no idea who put it there. But that's a perfect example of somebody fulfilling this commandment right here. So if it's within your power to take care of the poor among you. Now, I lived in Nashville for a while. There's a lot of homeless people. I made it a personal rule that I'd never give them money, because most likely it'd be used for drugs or alcohol or cigarettes. But if there was a homeless guy and I saw them, I would say, hey man, I said, can I get you something to eat? I'm sitting here, I'm about ready to go to this fast food place and grab me a bite. You want me to get you anything? And I would get that person whatever they wanted. You know, that was a modern way of fulfilling this commandment and providing for somebody that's poor. At least they would have a full belly. I mean, I couldn't give them a house. I couldn't buy them new clothes or a wardrobe, you know, but I could at least fill their belly, and that was something. So Deuteronomy 15:11 says, "For there will never cease to be poor people in the land. That is why I'm commanding you, open your hand willingly to your poor and needy brothers in your land." Now, it's interesting because Yeshua the Messiah, Jesus Christ, said the exact same things. Now, whenever Yeshua quoted Scripture, he quoted mostly from the book of Psalms and from Deuteronomy. And he basically said this in John chapter 12 regarding his anointing at Bethany. So let's go ahead and read that. John 12, starting with 1, it says, 6 days before Passover, Yeshua came to Bethany where Lazarus was, the one Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him, and Martha was serving him. And Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of perfume, pure and expensive nard and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, so the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Then one of the disciples, Judas, Yehudah Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And he was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put in it. Verse 7, here we go. Yeshua, Jesus answered, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial." Verse 8, he's quoting from Deuteronomy 15:7. He says, "For you will always have the poor with you." And then he goes on to say, "But you will not always have me." So we have just gone over 13 commandments regarding how we are to react to and provide for and accommodate and help out the poor, the unfortunate, the immigrant, the refugee, the permanent resident, the foreigner, the alien that lives among us in our country and in our community. And it also talks how we should not only provide for them, but also for the widowed, for the poor, for the orphan, for those that are poor that are the same ethnicity and that were native-born citizens, and they're just on the lower rung of the socioeconomic ladder than we are. So hopefully I was able to bring out some practical ways that we can apply these 13 commandments regarding the poor and unfortunate here in a 21st century context in our modern day. Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. Go out there and have a great day. God bless. Abraham'sDescendants.com, getting back to the first century in a 21st century way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to press the like button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and the notification bell that'll let you know every time I make a new video. And don't forget to share this with a friend. Also, visit our website at Abraham'sDescendants.com. Thanks. Shalom. Thanks for watching. Stay connected by subscribing to our other social media accounts and visiting our website at Abraham'sDescendants.com.